Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit. This is a lectionary-based preaching resource which is designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Eddie Boon. I'm here in East London, where I'm based, serving the Thames North Synod of the United Reformed Church as discipleship enabler. It's a privilege to be the host for this season and to share in some fascinating conversations and discussions, which we hope will be useful to you in your ministries. So today's guest is Julie Bryan. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, good to be here.
Julie is a part-time minister in a small Baptist church in the north of England, in the area where she's rooted and grew up. She holds a master's degree in contextual theology from Luther King Theological College in Manchester. Julie is also part of the Northumbrian Collective, which is a group of friends committed to listening well, thinking deeply, and living authentically. The collective produces podcasts and blogs and occasionally leads in-person retreats. Julie lives on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border with her husband, Stuart, who's a GP. In their spare time, they enjoy walking in the countryside, both near home and further afield across the north of England. And also joining us from the JPIT team today is Simeon Mitchell, who is JPIT's team leader. Welcome to you, Simeon.
Thank you.
So, just to kick off, as it happens in most of these podcasts, Julie, in terms of the relationship between what we call politics and the preaching ministry, how do you see the relationship between these two things, and how do you go about weaving a tapestry, if you like, of politics and the pulpit?
Thanks, Eddie. Well, there is definitely a link. I think politics does belong in the pulpit. If we look to Jesus, then we see his words and his actions are political, with not party political, but political. For example, in Luke 4, when he announces his ministry as being good news for the poor. I think that's a hugely political statement, and then he goes into more detail about what that might mean. Jesus lived in the context of empire under the Roman Empire, and so power and power structures are really interesting when we look at the Gospels and how Jesus interacted with people at different levels within those power structures. So that's all political, I think. The way he lifts up those who are vulnerable and marginalised, and demonstrates this good news for the poor in actions as well as words. And then later on, when the Holy Spirit is given to the early church, people share stuff. There's a sharing and a communal living element to the community that is the body of Christ. So I think in all our relationships, the way we care for one another, that matters, and that's political at community and society level.
Yeah.
And creation matters as well within all that. It's not just about people, it's about care for the planet and the world that God's made.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. That's really helpful seeing at the different sort of levels, not hierarchy, but interrelatedness of different parts of life as we see it. So, before we launch into the texts for the day or for the week, just to set a little bit of context and a few things that have been going on in the news. We've just begun the UK's third heat wave of the year. I gather there's another amber heat warning for the Midlands, Eastern and Southern England for later this week. England have progressed to the quarterfinals of the World Cup after beating Mexico. FIFA have become embroiled in yet another integrity scandal. And England lost the final of the Women's T20 World Cup, sadly. Thousands have taken to the streets in Tehran for the former Iranian Supreme Leader's funeral. And Russia has hit Kyiv with ballistic missiles, killing 10, injuring 48 people. Whilst there have also been widespread power cuts across the illegally occupied region of Crimea, as Ukraine has struck multiple targets there. quite a bit going on in the news at the moment. Some awareness focuses at the moment. We're into plastic-free July, and there may be people who are here, subscribers to this podcast, that are working out ways to eradicate or minimize their plastic use. Also, a focus on human trafficking and also the Samaritans awareness as well. So share all these things, not to force the agenda, but they're there in the background, and I'm sure some of them will relate to the readings that we've got for today. So let me introduce those or list those. The lectionary readings for Sunday, the 19th of July, are from Genesis 28, Psalm 139, Romans 8, Matthew 13, and there are some alternative readings offered also: the Wisdom of Solomon, Isaiah 44, and Psalm 86. And you're in the bio, you'll find all these verses listed out for you. No preacher would, I think, attempt to use all those passages. But Julie, tell me where you would start here, do you think, as you've had a look at them and thought them through in terms of what the gospel may say and issues of justice for the church today?
Mm. I'm going to start with the Genesis one. Not necessarily that's what I'd preach on, but I think it's starting at the beginning of the story. But I think there's some important themes that would need treating with sensitivity, I think. But we can look at that story on a human level as well. So there's the story of Jacob running away. He's run away from his family. There's been some family drama, which many of us can relate to, because a lot of us have families that are, can be in conflict from time to time. So famously, he's stolen his brother's birthright, and that's happened in a background of jealousy and favoritism. And Esau's found out that Jacob's done that, so Jacob flees with the help of his mum, Rebecca, on this journey of I looked it up, it's between 600 and 700 miles, depending on which of the caravan routes he would have taken from Beersheba to Haran to his uncle Laban's house. And I guess I'd start on the human level, really, inviting people to imagine how Jacob might feel in that scenario. He's had to leave home quickly, he's running away. We imagine him a bit frightened of his big brother catching up with him. And I kind of wonder if he had time to think about the events leading to his departure. Has he felt guilty or any sense of remorse for what he's done, or is he just running and not really thinking about that? And so it kind of would lead me to invite people to think about people in the world today who are on the run from things or moving, displaced because of either conflict on a family level or even a bigger scale in the wars that we've heard about, or because of climate change and the changing of how difficult life is for people in certain regions of our world. And Jacob's in a really hard place. I mean, I love the detail that he lays his head on a stone to sleep. Like, it doesn't get harder than that, does it? He's in a really hard place. We take our home comforts for granted. And I just kind of would invite people into that human experience of migration in a hurry because your life depends on it. And I know that it's human trafficking. That's a theme as well. So people being taken advantage of as well within all that. I guess that's where I'd start.
Yes, that's really helpful. This sort of relationship between the temporal and the physical, and the fear and the sense in which God can also be there. That wonderful verse that, surely God was in this place, but I did not know. Simeon, is there anything from this passage or anything that Julie's said so far from this Genesis passage that has got you thinking, or yeah?
I immediately went in the same direction as Julie and thought about how this relates to those who are kind of on the move, far from home, freeing from situations today. And The idea of a refugee is quite a modern concept. The definition of a refugee is someone who faces a well-founded fear of persecution. And I think it's fair to say that Jacob faced a well-founded fear of persecution. So I think we could say he was a refugee. He had to flee his home. And there are 117 million people in that situation today who've had to leave their homes. 36 million of those are refugees. There's big conversations happening in our society about how we respond to those who are in that need. Very often, what gets lost in that is the human experience of what actually people are feeling, what it's like to be unmoored, to be cast out, to be away from a place of safety. And I think you get something as you read this passage from Genesis of the sense of relief that Jacob feels when he hears God's voice in this place. And it's clearly a place which is a place going to become a place of safety, a place of refuge, a safe place to be. And God promises in the dream that this will be a land that you can live in. And my sense is that many people in our world today long to have that sense. And also that many people in our churches are those who would seek to provide that sense to those who are coming to this country and looking for safe places here. And I know that there are many ministries going on among asylum seekers and refugees and people who are displaced for all sorts of other reasons that our churches offer. And that is holy work in my mind.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you, Simeon. Thought struck me as you were both speaking there about, there not being strict borders and lines on maps back in those days, but there's a sense in what God is offering to Jacob is a place to live, but not like some kind of tribal inheritance to be held tightly. We In our last episode we did have a discussion about inheritance in the context of stealing it, but this whole thing about being a blessing for all people, um, that's really challenging. I think for the world and for the church, how can we offer a safe place that doesn't turn into a ghetto, and how can we as a church not end up being a ghetto? Being a blessing to all people is a real thing of justice and going to the heart of God. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember as well that Genesis was written in the exile or post-exile period when the people of God were without their land and without that. So they were remembering the promises that God had made to Abraham and then here to Jacob about the land and it belonging to them and their offspring, but with that extra blessing that's here, that it's to all people. The blessing will be for all people. And obviously we're in talking about Palestine as a piece of land here, and so it needs really delicate handling by preachers, I think, real sensitivity to understand and interpret that. But it is worth noting that according to Oxfam, almost the entire population of Gaza, which is 2.1 million people, have been displaced. And so this is it's kind of flipped on its head, isn't it? Here we've got Jacob wanting to return to the land, and be where he's been called to be a blessing to all people. So I just think it's a tricky passage. Like I say, I'm not sure I would actually use it to preach on it for the Sunday we're talking about, but it certainly presents an opportunity to just pray for the region and pray for that part of the world and other parts of the world where land is the source of a dispute. Land's being fought over.
Yeah, I hear in your voice a sense of lament, which is bound to be in the thinking of any preacher. And when we think about how we do, suddenly when we get land, we do, that natural human tendency is to protect rather than to open it up to others in need. Yeah.
Yeah, but the promise of God, to be with Jacob wherever he goes, I think it's important that the blessing of God isn't limited to that piece of land, like many pagan gods were thought to be at the time. God promises to be with him wherever he goes, and that obviously links to the psalm. but I think that's key for anyone who is feeling displaced, that God still sees them on their journey, wherever it may go and however difficult or arduous it is.
Yeah, God doesn't dwell in buildings
Mm-hmm.
or or temples. Yeah, yeah, and of course later the whole loss of the temple
Mm-hmm.
was a great crisis for that. But God was there in the creation of the synagogues and the different way of doing things.
And again,
Yeah,
remembering this was written down in the exile or post-exile period, so they're kind of remembering that promise when they're not in that place. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. Do you think that's sort of temptation for, I would say idolatry exactly, but this temptation to get the piece of land or get up the ladder and then pull the ladder up behind you so that it only well, I don't know about you, but I see that in so much of the world and our own nation today. How can we model something different as a church? How can we encourage the church to be a bit more Christ-like in a way?
I think that's a good question that we should leave people with, Eddie. In a way, I'm not sure that any of my immediate answers are going to be add much to it. I
Yeah.
guess the one thing I sort of note we haven't really talked about it is this
Mm-hmm.
vision that is offered to Jacob in this place, and whether it's because it's a thin place, a place where heaven and earth are close, or simply because it's the time for God to speak. But that vision is a dialogue between heaven and earth. And
Mm.
really, I think that's something that we're called to be attuned to in our lives, in our churches, in our Christian life. And when we come to look at the Romans passage in particular, that's got things to say about that as well. How do we live in this place that is here, very much in a reality, in a place, but also in dialogue with what's
Mm-hmm.
going on in heaven, with what's going on in the kind of big picture of things. And I think there's an invitation here to think about that as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And of course, Jacob anoints the stone, doesn't he? So there is this sort of
Mm.
sacredness of this dialogue. It's not
Mm.
just about the stone, is it? Yeah, that's how do we see that relationship with God and its outworking in our lives as being something sacramental in a way, a means of
Mm.
grace and anointing.
Yeah, and the up and down movement as well. It's not just one way, is it? It's both ways, up and down.
Mhm.
And recognizing that God's grace was present because Jacob, is still quite messed up at this point. He's still on the run, and yet God doesn't wait for Jacob to be fixed and ready and sorted. God comes in the mess. So I think
Yeah,
that's really encouraging to us who live in the mess. And again, that links to the Romans passage and the Gospel passage, I think, too, doesn't it?
yeah, the weeds and the wheat growing together,
Hmm.
and how we can
Hmm.
be patient and yet active is a really incredible word. Yeah. Does it relate to the Psalm 139, this sense of God knowing us
Hmm.
best, almost better than we know ourselves, and God knowing these situations? It doesn't always help us in our lament and our struggles, but how does that passage speak to us?
Yeah, I think it links, as I've said, to Jacob's experience and the promise God makes to be present and to protect him wherever he goes. That's definitely a theme that comes out of the psalm. But there is also, as you say, the knowledge that God has of Jacob, of not just the observable features, but the inner life as well. So the psalm speaks of God knowing a person's thoughts, feelings, their words before they're spoken, um, and knowledge beyond our understanding. I think that's a real theme that runs through all these four passages, that God knows something that we don't in the moment.
Mm,
God knows more than we do, and trusting in that, the transcendence of God, but also the immanence, the intimacy of God with us. I mean, that is just mind blowing stuff, isn't it?
yeah,
And there's no escape from God, but that's a good thing. Not in a threatening, uh, kind of eye in the sky way, but a positive in a positive way. There's no escape from God. It's a loving, caring, nurturing kind of presence.
yeah. That's an obvious link, isn't it, between the Psalm and the Genesis passage,
Mm.
that there's nowhere we can go, and countless biblical figures find that to be true, and
Hmm.
that can be a challenge that even when we mess up, or even when some of these political or social or cultural challenges seem unsolvable,
Hmm.
um, we can't escape from God's presence. We can either join in with what God is doing in God's good sort of time, or but we can't escape. We can't
Hmm.
flee.
Mm.
I think it also means that we shouldn't fear. And this
Hmm.
is where it links to Romans and the gospel passage, because
Mm,
if God knows all that we've done and all that we're going to do, and all the things that we do that we're ashamed of and that we might be fearful about bringing before God, then that changes the nature of the relationship.
yeah.
It's all in the open, so we don't have to be afraid. Um,
Mm,
the Romans passage talks about living not in fear, but um, in this choice of knowing what's happening, the inevitable coming of the kingdom.
Hmm.
Um,
mm,
and then the gospel also talks about judgment. And I guess it's inviting us to not fear that either. Um,
mm.
Whilst there might be things that we would judge ourselves for, perhaps this is an invitation to think, no, God knows all of that, and God still wants to be in a relationship with us. God still knows us and will be with us wherever we go.
Mm.
Yeah, this groaning and decay that we sense around us, but that we needn't be in fear or condemnation. This whole cosmic thing, which, as you rightly point out, is there in the parable, isn't it? The sense of we might not get immediate answers to our actions, but love wins, God will win in the situation down the line.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. And I really like the way the psalm ends, with that prayer of yielding, asking God to help us continue to grow, recognizing that we aren't the finished article. We're a work in progress.
Mm,
That you're saying to God, show me what I need to do to change, to keep growing in faithfulness, in knowledge of God. A desire to please this God that is so awesome and has this knowledge. As you say, Eddie knows us better than we know ourselves. So ask that God for guidance and as to how to be led onward on the journey of faith. So
yeah.
I really like that response bit at the end, having recognised God's awesomeness, that there's a yielding to God and His wisdom.
Yeah, see if there be any grievous way in me and lead me in the way
Mm.
everlasting. That's a
Hmm.
real dose of humility. I don't,
Hmm.
in all the campaigns that JPIT are involved in, and we are
Mm.
as Christians and as local congregations, sometimes we can overreach, can't we,
Mm.
and lose that humility.
Hmm.
And that Matthew passage is a bit like that, isn't it? To
Mm.
to rush to do the weeding and
Hmm.
to cancel the weeds straight away is so much harder, isn't it?
Yeah.
To the ambiguity of life with both good and evil
Mm.
struggling through.
And I think there's a challenge if we're applying it from but I was trying to think, how do we apply this kind of politically? Then what is the political slant of this? And I just think it's about the social. When we look at social injustice, if this psalm applies to everyone, if everyone is loved by God like this, then shouldn't that impact the way we treat one another in the broadest sense? So whether we're thinking about refugees, as you've already mentioned, Simeon, or people who use food banks, or people who we might see, or we might be invited to see as lesser. Um, I think this psalm reminds us to think about, with humility, how we treat others as well.
Yeah, to take reasonable steps. Yeah, to
Hmm.
take to do something, in the right direction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The other thing I'd just put in at this point is I used to be a science teacher, and so the bit about, which isn't actually, when you look at the verses chosen by the lectionary, they skip over the bit about the human body being intricately made, wondrously made. But that's one of my favourite bits, because the more I learnt about human biology, that was my subject, my first degree, and I was a science teacher in both primary and secondary schools. The more I learnt about the human body, the more my faith in God grew. And students would ask me, how can you be a scientist and believe in God? And for me, there's just no competition at all. This is one of those key texts. So anyone out there who's got that whole science versus faith thing going on, this is where one of the things I'd point them to.
Yeah, such knowledge seems too wonderful, but you're giving witness to the fact of the wonderful nature of who we are. Yeah.
And that was written down before we knew as much as we do about our bodies. That was written down hundreds and hundreds of years ago before we knew how the heart works, for example, or the eye works, or whatever.
So that's good news, the sort of the dignity and the God being present intimately with us, and in there's nowhere we can flee away from it. In terms of Heartbeat for Justice, is there any bad news here for anybody or any situation, do you think? I mean, we've spoken about those that treat the refugee unkindly and persecute them. What is the relationship between good and bad news here, do you think?
I think it's notable that this knowledge that God has of each of us is of the good and the ill in us, isn't it? So those who perpetuate evil, who think that are getting away with it, also kind of should hear from this that they're not. That God knows. God knows about everything, and whilst it's an invitation to see that of God in everyone, we shouldn't skip over the judgment that is ultimately coming too. And so I suppose it's a warning for those whose actions are not wholly good as well.
Yeah, it talks about darkness and light being the same to God, and that's anything that's hidden in the dark. It reminds me of that verse. Everything that's been hidden will eventually be brought into the light, and that's as you're speaking. So anything that's not nice that's going on, that's not healthy or not good, will eventually be brought out into the light, and everyone will know, or God will know, it will be revealed. Yeah.
And far from pushing us into some sort of quietism that thinks, well, it's all good to come out in the wash or down the line, eschatologically, so to speak, it doesn't mean that we sit back and do nothing. It's clear that these passages are talking about like human agency and God's involvement, and so I'm sure preachers on this passage will want to try and maybe think through some concrete examples of how that's worked out in their lives and in the life of the local church as well. Sometimes people are tempted to say, well, I just can't cope with this. I'm frightened by the seeming brokenness. No matter how hard I try, things don't seem to get better. The temptation is to say, well, I'm going to sit back and just do nothing and let God sort it all out.
So I think that's why that last bit, the last couple of verses, that little prayer of submission is at the end of that's where it ends with an individual person, because it's written in the first person, isn't it? It's a singular psalm. It's an I and a me. It's not a we and an us psalm. It's an individual person. So if every person prayed that last prayer at the end, what would the world look like? And so each of us has agency over what we can do, how God is leading us. Every small difference matters, and don't be convinced otherwise.
Yeah, we don't have to wait for all these questions to be answered or everything to be made complete. We have to live with that. Are there any sort of phrases or words that would stick in our mind, sort of takeaways of people who are reading these passages in church or having them preached on?
For me, I think it's the Romans one that's full of quotable quotes and useful wisdom and things to really dig into. I don't know what Julie has to say about that, and I look forward to hearing that. But for me, there is so much in there that the lines like, you didn't receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption, and just the whole that whole idea of adoption. Adoption's been in the news a lot in the last couple of weeks because of the government's apology over the forced adoption scandal, and the way in which children were taken from unmarried mothers over many decades. and the harm that did. But here we're seeing adoption used in a positive way, about being welcomed into a new family, taken care of, treated as one of God's children, with Christ as our brother, Christ as our co-heir. And I think there is so much richness in that we could explore about what adoption might look like in a positive way, in contrast to that report and that apology that were made, that where adoption is was a scandal, was a deed of the darkness, really, that has now been uncovered.
Definitely. That's really
Yeah.
brilliant that you bring that up. Yeah, this co-heir, this collaboration in that inheritance of the kingdom reminds us that it's not all down to us to struggle through everyone. So therefore, we need to not fear. Thank you. That's really excellent.
And I see a link back to the Jacob passage, the passage from Genesis where God, he becomes a child of God. He's, the promise is made to Jacob and his descendants to be a child of God. And obviously through Jesus, that's extended to all of us, Jews and Gentiles. So that promise of God we see the big overarching story of God, I think, across these passages from the Genesis here to the letter to the Romans, that we're all invited to be in relationship with a loving God. And the phrase that jumps out at me as a woman is the groaning that feels like childbirth. As we wait, moving on in the Romans passage to the bit about looking forward to when everything will be resolved, to when God's glory will be revealed, the idea at creation and believers are waiting with this groaning. And the only example, the example that Paul gives is of childbirth. And I think that's, again, with sensitivity in the congregations, appropriate use, that could be upsetting for some people. But as a mother, I know what that feels like. And there will be people in your congregations who know what that feels like, that groaning and the longing and the just get this bit over so the good stuff can happen. I think that's a real, embodied experience of faith that many will be able to relate to.
Yes. And that's really helpful. And there's other aspects of if you like, the groaning lament or suffering that, we can't, we don't say to people that this suffering will bring about something good. That's not, I don't think that's the gospel. But we do have a story ourselves, don't we, of where situations that seemed unresolved may not be resolved in a nice, neat and tidy ABC, but we see something of God, and that's Jesus, the suffering servant, who identifies with these groaning, painful, ongoing things of which we try and be patient about.
Yeah. And there's hope in there. Hope gets a mention as well in Romans, which is obviously an incredibly powerful word, a great word, real depth to it. And so, again, if people were looking for how to pray for the world, then any victims of people from human action, from climate change, from just people that are suffering of illness in your own churches, even that are waiting and groaning and longing for things to be better. A time of lament and yet a time of hopeful waiting, I think, is this passage. Well, all the passages, well, the gospel and this one particularly lend themselves to those kind of themes.
Yeah, and I mentioned fairly near the beginning some of these awareness days, and one of them was Samaritan's awareness, and that very much chimes with that there are many people today that feel like, because of things happened in their own lives, or because of the circumstances around them, they feel like there is no hope, and they're fearful, and that's a reminder that there are doors, and there are opportunities, and there are people who will listen, and who will speak a kind word in season and out of season.
And the Holy Spirit, the Romans passage starts with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit's role in helping people live in a not sinful way, put to death sin, and the Spirit is the power, gives us the power to do that. So it's not just a human agency thing; it's an access to the Spirit of God to enable us to do this. So it's there's a humility again there, isn't there, about needing God's help, recognizing our need of God's help to do these things, to keep on hoping.
Yeah.
Thinking about the hope, I was doing some research in anticipation of this conversation, and I hadn't really been struck before about the kind of this metaphor of childbirth. One of the things about childbirth is it's inevitable, isn't it? You go through the pain, but there is going to be something that happens after it. And so it's not just groaning and pain for the sake of it. It's because something is happening and it's on its way, and you can't stop it. You can't stop it from happening. And I guess that's partly the hope too, that the kingdom is there, is coming. It's coming, and it's now. And that is also the ground. That is the grounds for hope, isn't it? But that is the reality that's emerging, that's bursting free from the sort of from the body at the moment. And I think it's really interesting that Paul chooses that image. It might be in stark contrast to a kind of quite a patriarchal image that we might have of how a kingdom might emerge from a diktat of a ruler and someone taking charge. No, this is bursting forth from a body, whether you like it or not. And I think, I was struck by the power of that again in reading this.
That's brilliant. So it's like it's here now, and it's a foretaste of something that is deeply eternal, including the here and now. That's really, really helpful. And mentioned earlier about awareness days of periods, human trafficking as well. This part of, the refugee crisis, if you like, of translocation of people. Within that, there are people who are very vulnerable to those that will abuse them and take advantage of them in terms of human trafficking. And I'm not sure there's easy answers out of these passages, but it's a reminder that within, if you like, the movement of people, there will always be people who will prey, and usually for profit, prey upon people and traffic them. Well, I think we're beginning to draw to an end. Our conversation has been utterly fascinating, given me all sorts of additional things to think about, and so that's been really brilliant. Thank you to Julie and to Simeon. In a moment, I'm just going to ask, when we close, just maybe ask you for one sentence out of what we've discussed that you perhaps could leave us to hold on to. Thank you, subscribers, for listening. I hope this episode helps you in your preaching preparation and ministry. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Share this episode with your friends and colleagues, and may God bless you in your preaching ministry. We also have other online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and political processes on our social media platforms. So if you'd be willing to, Simeon, leave us a little soundbite, a little sentence that is emerging from our conversation today.
One of the things I was thinking about is that this Sunday that we're talking about is the day before we are likely to have a new prime minister in our country, and we haven't particularly talked about the kind of political current politics, and that's absolutely fine. But the gospel reading, and I think the message of that is partly about not rushing to judgment. And I was reflecting with colleagues on how the kind of the media news cycle, the instant kind of snap judgment culture is one of the things that's played a role in the downfall of several recent prime ministers. This is not a party political point. We've lost quite a succession of prime ministers over quite rapid period of time over the last 10 years. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But one of them, I think, is that culture of people rushing to judge and not necessarily giving time for things to play out and to see how they turn out. So as the new prime minister takes up their role, my thought for the day is, let's not rush to judgment. Let's give time to see what might bear fruit out of that change.
Superb. Thank you, Simeon. That's really good news. Yeah. Julie.
it's kind of linked to that, really. I was thinking about, again, the gospel passage, which we've not really gone into in much depth, but it seems to be about waiting again and holding the questions. So there's something about holding the questions with a calmness, with a sense of peace, because we're trusting in what is to come, and relating to the Romans passage. So I guess it would be, do not fear, hold the questions, and just wait patiently to see what God will do. That seems to sum up the gospel passage, and kind of, you could imagine Jacob thinking that too, in his back where we started, in his situation there with his head on a stone. So yeah, hold the questions, wait and see what God's going to do, and don't be frightened.
Thank you so much. So that's a really hopeful and encouraging place to leave this Politics in the Pulpit podcast. Thank you.